do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, our next witness is Arthur Taylor.
Mr. Taylor, can I ask you to make your commencing statement under the Inquiries Act as follows? Do you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you will give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Taylor. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Taylor, can you confirm, please, that your full name is Arthur William Taylor?
It is.
And I think you currently still live in Dunedin?
That's correct.
You have prepared a witness statement for the Royal Commission's hearing today, which
Yes.
I hope you have in front of you there.
I do have it.
You can confirm that it's dated the 3rd of October and that you've signed it on the last page 16.
Yes, that's my signature on the final page, page 16.
Mr. Taylor, the Commission's already received your statement, so can you just confirm again that it's true and correct?
It is true and correct.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you some questions coming out of that. Perhaps if we could start on page 2 with the circumstances of you going into care when I think you were aged 11.
Yes, that's correct. I was aged about 11 and I was put in the Pooney Boys Home through what we commonly called wagging school.
Why did you used to wag school?
Well, I was, I suppose, quite well ahead of the other students in my class, and school got quite boring for me at times, and I actually used to like to learn at my own pace, so I'd quite often take days off school and go up to the local library because we didn't have the internet in them days, and learn up there out of books and things. Yeah.
So on times when you weren't at school, you were actually going to the library?
I was. Well, sometimes if it was summer I'd be out fishing or swimming, but yeah, a lot of the time I was at the library, yeah.
You were living in Masterton, I think, with your family?
That's right, yes. My parents owned a business in Masterton, and I lived with them. And we were a family of six, I think it was 5 children at that stage, yes. We had my youngest sister Joanne was born in 1969. I'd already been in Ipuni by that stage.
We might be going just a little bit too fast. You'll be conscious that we have a stenographer and some sign interpreters here. So
sure. Okay, well, just go fast.
I'll put my hand up?
Yep.
Will do. So, you've told us that you were 11, you were wagging school. Mm-hmm. How did you come to the notice of child welfare, as it was called?
I assume that the school authorities reported it to the see, in those days, what we now call, I suppose, the OT, Tamariki, that was a division of the Department of Education, the Child Welfare Division. So they were directly connected with the Department of Education, and I assume they received regular reports on who was attending and who, was not attending school. Yeah.
So what was the first contact that you had?
Well, the first contact I actually had with the child welfare officers was when 2 of them turned up one morning at my parents' business and told my parents and me that I had to come with them. Apparently they had some sort of warrant from the court to uplift me, and I want to say quite clearly here that we'd never had any prior notification of this. It hadn't gone to court, and they were going to take me off somewhere. Yeah.
At paragraph 11 of your statement, you've referred to NUPC. What was that?
That's what the term was used, not being under proper control. NUPC. Obviously, there'd been no criminal offence committed by me or my parents, so they referred to it. They had a charge under the, I guess, the inapplicable legislation of not being under proper control. NUPC, and that's what they called it. Hmm.
So moving to, I think, paragraph 13, Mr. Taylor, which is page 3, you've said just before that 2 welfare officers turned up?
Yes, I did.
Your parents' business?
After it sort of sunk into my parents what was going on, my mum was, me and my mum were very particularly close. My dad was sort of not so close because he'd been through the Second World War and the sort of stuff that I guess he'd gone through. He was sort of a bit, they didn't express their feelings too well. They were sort of reserved, my dad. But my mum didn't. She was, she was very distraught, when she realised what was going on. Back then, nowadays I suppose they'd be challenged about it, but back then people thought the state knew what was best, and they thought they couldn't take them on. So I guess they sort of surrendered to it.
What were you told?
I wasn't told anything. I was just told I was getting taken away from my family. I was, our family was particularly close. We came from a farming background. I was actually born in the Hokianga, which is right up north. It was pretty much cut off from the rest of New Zealand, actually. The nearest road was to Dargaville in the south. That was a gravel road through the Waipua forest. The other one was a gravel road to Kaikoui. We were predominantly Maori community. 70% of the community was Maori, 30% Pākehā. We were a very close, supportive community. And up there, sort of wagging school, I suppose, like you'd call it, was pretty much tolerated because children would take time off to do haymaking, help with farm operations, things like that. It wasn't sort of tolerated.
Down a little. Sorry, you said it was sort of tolerated?
It was sort of tolerated, it was, I guess, in the community interest.
What do you recall of the time when these child welfare officers arrived at your parents' business?
That was relatively early in the morning, and as I say, two of them turned up, and I got very upset and angry when I thought I was being taken away from my family because we'd never been sort of apart before. So I guess I started yelling and screaming and getting very distraught. At one point they were going to call the police, but they didn't call the police. They ended up calling a doctor, and I remember that doctor because I was already screaming when I realised he was going to inject me with a syringe because I hate needles, yeah.
And what happened?
Well, I was actually injected with some sort of sedative, not two more child welfare officers turned up. I remember it very, very vividly because my mum was, obviously crying and very distraught, and it was a very harrowing time. Yeah. And I eventually was, obviously the sedative had some sort of effect. It didn't actually knock me totally unconscious, but I remember being carried out and put on the back seat of a car and transported over the Rimutaka Hills to Wellington, to Ipini Boys Home.
Did they tell you where you were going?
No, they didn't. They just said they were taking me somewhere. Yeah.
And what happened when you arrived at the boys' home?
I was taken in. Back in them days, this was 1968, they hadn't built the secure block at Ipuni yet, which is akin to police cells. So they used to put you in a room, I always remember it was on the right side as you went in through the main doors at the entrance to the place. Taken in there, and the curtains were pulled, and all your clothes were taken off you, and they were replaced with sort of school uniform type clothes. And you were left there just in the dark. They pulled the thing and told you that you had to go to sleep.
Looking back now, did you have any kind of induction or proper introduction to why you were there?
Not that day, no. Later on, a housemaster called me down to the office at some stage and told me that I was going to be there for some months at least. Couldn't be precise about that. And that's why I'd be staying, and I better get used to it. Yeah.
What about social workers? Was there any present at that time in your first stint at Ipuni?
No, I can't really remember any. Obviously there were housemasters and, I remember the cook very well, Miss Hart, and people like that, but not like you'd have a assigned social worker now, I guess, that sort of takes on your case and manages it and keeps you up to date with what's going on. No, you didn't have any of that. The housemasters were the people that really ran the place and carried out what you'd call social work functions, I guess, nowadays.
At paragraph 20 of your statement, you refer to a memory of your parents arriving to visit you, you think, within the first week of being there.
I think it was the first weekend I was there. My parents turned up and they bought me comics and chocolates and things. You were allowed to have that sort of stuff brought in. My mum was very upset, I always remember that, because she was wanting to know how long I was going to be in this place, and no one was able to tell her. And she asked the management. She had tried to see the manager there, Mr. Howe, and hadn't been able to find anything out. She had phoned him actually, and in them days toll calls weren't like today, they were quite expensive. And she'd been phoning them from Masterton, trying to find out what was going on.
Paragraph 21, you said that you have no idea whether your parents ever appeared in court or were charged for your truancy. But you make a comment there, something your mother told you years later.
Yes. My parents were actually charged board for me while I was in Ipuni. They had to pay, they were still paying it off when I got out. Yeah, they had to pay. They stopped family, we used to have a payment called family benefit. They stopped all that, which my parents sort of relied on. I think they had a housing loan back then, and you'd have to capitalise this family benefit, and they had to pay a lot of that back. They were put in quite bad financial straits over this. But they definitely had to pay board for me while I was in Ipuni Boys Home. Yeah.
I want to move on to page 5 of your statement, Mr. Taylor, under a heading that we've got there of abuse at a Ipuni Boys Home.
Yeah, well, I very quickly found out, I always vividly remember my first night in that place, right? We were in what was the old gym. They later built a new gymnasium, but they had this little old gym when I was there, like a relatively small room, I suppose, as big as this.
Just need to slow down just a little, Mr. Taylor, sorry.
And one of the other kids asked me what I was doing there. Well, I thought, well, I'm here for wagging school, because I knew by that stage that was what I was supposed to have done. Then it must be such a horrible crime. And you've got to remember that I wasn't acclimatised to crime in them days, that I just wouldn't say what I was in there for. I sort of fobbed them off, because to end up in a place like that, you had done something really bad, in my opinion. Well, my sort of understanding.
How many boys do you think were there when you first arrived?
Probably would have been 30. I would estimate 30. And they ranged in age from probably about 9 through to about 14. They had the younger ones in a unit called Carry Unit that was right by the housemaster's office, and they were the quite young ones, and the rest were spread through Rata and the other wings.
What were your impressions of this boys' home after a few days there?
Well, my overwhelming impression, of course, was I'm away from my family, who I've never been apart from in my life before, and I'm in a place with strangers, and I don't know when I'm going back to my family. That's my overwhelming impression. But it wasn't a nice atmosphere in the place either. There was bullying going on. There was, the staff weren't helpful. You just didn't know what was going on. You weren't given any information about what you were doing there. And the strange thing was, because I was in there for not going to school, and they never gave you any schooling. They never even had a school. I think some of the other children did correspondence. Later on they built a school at Ipuni, but when I first went there was no school.
Did you ask about schooling?
No, I didn't. You didn't really ask them anything because, they weren't very helpful, and I guess you didn't want to do anything to stick out. You didn't want to stick out from the other kids. Because that could attract unwarranted attention to you,
You said there was bullying. Can you explain what you mean?
Oh, well, the bigger kids used to beat up the littler ones, because we'd get outside and play games and that outside. And it was, you had a kingpin there sort of thing, I suppose you'd call them nowadays. And
well, we heard the evidence from, you will have heard Keith Whiffin's evidence earlier about kingpin. Is that something that you experienced as well?
I never heard that term at that stage.
I think, to be fair, he was a couple of years after you.
Yes. We just had a sort of guy that predominantly, like in any sort of human sort of relationship, society, someone's sort of, the top dog and someone's not the top dog sort of thing. And, the bigger and stronger kids, they were running the show. They used to beat the little kids up. And I was horrified about that because I'd never been exposed to violence before this. My family was a close and loving family, and I hadn't seen any of this sort of stuff going on, you know. And it was totally foreign to me.
What did the staff, do, if anything, about the violence that was going on?
Well, nothing that I can recall. No one was ever punished for fighting or anything. They'd soon punish you for other things, like, you know, not doing the dishes properly and stuff like that, or not doing the cleaning jobs properly. But the fighting, no, they seemed to almost enjoy it, some of them. I'm not making a generalisation here, because I do remember a couple of reasonably good housemasters, but, you know, generally it was the ones that were the bad ones that predominated, you know, they had to say. And Mr. Howell, he used to live over the back in a house behind the place, but you never really saw him anyway. He was like the manager of the place.
If I could refer you to paragraph 29 of your statement.
Yes. Well, the things, I didn't myself experience any actual sexual abuse or anything. It was mainly like physical abuse, but you knew it was going on around you, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about that in a minute. It was something that really stuck in my mind. It used to happen almost every Sunday, right?
Slowly.
Yeah. A couple of the housemasters used to live on the premises, but there was an atmosphere of like stress, anxiety, I suppose you'd call it now. You know, that was pervasive. And, you know, that's like I was coming from a loving family atmosphere, and being thrown into the middle of this. You know, you just don't know what they can do to you and what they can't do to you. Which I suppose is what triggered my interest in studying the law in later years.
We'll come back to the sexual abuse issue in a second. You, though, in your statement at the top of page 6, paragraph 30, refer to a report that the Education Department Psychological Service completed on you in June 1968, where it describes some of your qualities and...
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, as a result of the class, process, which I went through, my records were divulged to me, and I came across a psychological report from 18th of June 1968, when I was aged 11 years 10 months. And it was interesting to observe that on the Peabody vocabulary test, I had a mental age of 18 years plus, and an IQ of 140 and 150, which was above the, the 99th percentile for my age group. And that report's been provided to the staff of the Commission. The same report said, and this is very interesting to me, the profile here does not show any extreme responses, but there are some significant and perhaps conflicting trends. He appears as being basically warm-hearted, good-natured, cooperative, and easygoing, with a tendency to be impulsive at times. He is also shown to be sentimental, emotional, and artistic, with a liking for people. On the other hand, there are features associated with disobedience and rejection of authority. I reckon that came about after my placement in Ipuni. There is also a tendency for him to be self-effacing, depressed, and uncommunicative.
And the same would apply, would it? You think those were features that...
At that point, I'd been in Ipuni, I think, about 3 months when they did that test, yeah. So the interesting thing was that my wagging school obviously hadn't affected my ability to learn or my education. You know, and here I was in this place for because of this. And so they knew this. You know, they had this report. Yeah.
So, just moving to paragraph 32, Mr Taylor, you just told us that you recall being in Ipuni the first time for about 3 months, and that there were punishments that you, I think, suffered and also witnessed during that time. Can you tell us about those?
Well, if you, disobeyed any of the rules of the place, they had a massive leather strap that they used to really whip you with, you know. Now, I remember one night I was in the showers and I'd been whacked with this strap several times, obviously for some transgression. And one of the other boys said, "Look at those big welts up your back, Arthur." They're massive red welts, from the strap. So they've been belting the hell out of my back with this leather strap, and that was like a punishment there for whatever the heck I'd done.
Did you witness physical abuse on other children?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. The same sort of thing. The strapping and going on, and you just didn't know what they could do to you. That's the whole. That was one of the big things about it. You just didn't know what they could or could not do to you, and they led you to believe that they could do anything, that you were right in their power. They could stop you from going home. They could stop you from seeing your parents. There was no phones in them days, so you couldn't ring anybody. The only mail that went out of the place went through the housemasters. And if you wrote something they didn't like, I reported, you said to your parents, what's going on here, they just wouldn't send it. Because my parents never received any very few letters from me. And certainly none, because I used to write to them what was going on, what's happening to me. And they never received those letters.
What other types of punishments did they have at Apuni while you were there?
Oh, well, yeah, one of them particularly sticks out in my mind. They used to have a massive rugby field there, right? It was a really big rugby field out the back of the place, and one of the punishments was they'd put you in bare feet and just wear a pair of shorts, and this would be sometimes in the middle of winter, and a t-shirt on, and they'd get you to mow this massive rugby field with a hand mower, and these are little children, relatively small kids we're talking about. And of course, when you're a child, I always remember this rugby field seemed like massive to me, and you'd have to mow this thing, and you weren't allowed to stop. Well, you were allowed to stop, to go to the toilet and things, but I mean, you weren't allowed to go off and do anything else until you'd done what they wanted you to do.
You refer in your statement to standing on the line. What was that? Yeah,
they had out the back by the housemaster's office, they had I suppose it was a foursquare thing marked out, right, for paying foursquare. And if any of the other kids had caused any problems there, or there'd been some problems for the staff, they'd get all the children to stand on those lines, and you wouldn't be allowed to move until a suitable time had gone by. Sometimes a couple of hours, you'd have to stand on this line and not move, and that was like a punishment for the whole sort of boys' home for anything the other kids might have done. If they decided that they'd impose what you call a group punishment.
You mention in your statement at paragraph 35 that the children would sometimes self-discipline. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, if the kids fell over, I remember them being taken away and strapped, if they fell over. And it had happened, and particularly in the heat. It was just... Yeah, we were ruled by fear. Summing it up, we were ruled by fear of, what they could do to us, and that we had no sort of comeback. You just didn't have a clue about anything.
You go on at paragraphs 36 and 37 to talk about older children beating up little ones and also staff members. This
used to really distress me, because I don't like people using, beating other people, and they'd get pleasure. I've never seen this before. They get pleasure out of inflicting harm on other people, other children, and it's had a real big impact on me. I didn't think people could do that sort of thing, but they did. And these were other children.
And what, if anything, did the staff at Apuni do about that?
I don't recall them doing anything because it carried on happening. So if they'd done anything, it wasn't been effective at stopping it. Yeah.
At paragraph 37, Mr Taylor, you describe an opinion that some of the staff seemed to think that the violence was sport. Expand on that.
Well, some of the staff almost, I suppose it'd be like watching a boxing match or something. They thought this was like entertainment, some of them. And again, it's not all of them, it's just a few of them. But the other staff that were the good ones, they never sort of did anything about stopping it. And these were kids we're talking about. some of the older boys would get, favours from the staff, like cigarettes and things. If they had any of the kids that were playing, causing problems around there, some of them would be wetting beds and things like that. They'd get them to beat them up and reward them with cigarettes and things like that.
Can we move now, please, Mr Taylor, to the issue of sexual abuse at a puni? I understand that you yourself were not a victim of sexual abuse while you were at a puni.
That's right.
But what did you know about?
Well, it was a little Maori fella, Maori boy, that about 9 years of age, I suppose. And I liked this little fella. He was so quiet and and I wonder why he was so quiet. And then I found out every Sunday one of these housemasters used to call him over to his private quarters, which were on the boys' home premises, and he'd sexually abuse him over there. And this poor little fella would be, terrified for days leading up to this. And it really affected me, that. Because I couldn't do anything about it to help him stop it,
Was there talk among the children?
Yeah, that's right, about certain housemasters there was, yeah. Yeah, what they used to do to them and things like that. I wouldn't go into any detail, I remember. But, they were terrified. Really terrified. Was there
the ability for you or any of the other boys in the home to make complaints about what was happening?
No, we didn't know anything about complaints. We didn't, as far as we were concerned, these people had power, ultimate power over us. I mean, they were like, I guess what you'd call the state.
Now,
there was no complaints procedure or nothing explained or anything. There was nothing like that in them days.
In your statement, you tell us at paragraph 38 about absconding a couple of times during your first stint, and then at 39 you talk about the fact that you're not sure why you were eventually able to go back to your parents after the first time, but you went back to school when you did go back to your mum and dad.
Yes, I did. I went back to school, yeah.
And what happened when you went back to school?
Well, word soon got around that you were like a welfare kid, that you'd been in Ipuni Boys Home, and it was looked on, the other kids would make fun of you and ostracise you because you'd been in trouble, I guess. In a little town like Marston, they sort of looked down on that sort of thing in them days.
And I think you were having to report regularly to a child welfare officer that was assigned to you, is that right?
That's right, I had to report to a particular child welfare officer. I used to have to go to his office and report to him there, yeah.
Do you remember how it is that you went back into a puni the second time, or why?
No, not really. I think it was going for wagging school, something like that. Well, I hadn't committed any crime. I'll tell you what my attitude to crime was back then. When I used to abscond from that boys' home, I would, like some of the other kids would go and steal cars and things like that. I wouldn't. I'd catch the train or something like that, because I just couldn't commit crimes.
We might just need you to come forward just a little, sorry, Arthur.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Like, I'd steal bottles of milk and, vegetables out of people's gardens rather than commit burglaries and crimes like some of the other kids that abscond would do. Crime was sort of still abhorrent to me. It wasn't on my radar screen.
When did it change?
Well, the third time it changed when I was in there, because after the third time I started absconding with other kids and they'd steal cars and we'd get arrested by the police, and then I'd come into contact with the police and end up in their cells and things like that, and I started to really take a dislike to the police because of the way they used to treat me, and that's, I guess, when it started. And your resistance to crime just starts crumbling away. You're in with people that, are doing things, and I guess you take on the mores of your peers. You start taking that on, and what would be, repugnant to you earlier suddenly becomes not repugnant, and that's how it happens. Yeah.
In your statement at paragraph 42, you talk about your third time at a puni, which was in 1970, I understand.
Yes, that's right.
And you talk about being in police cells when you were absconded, but by that stage there were cells at the boys' home, is that
right? The third time I went to Ipuni, which was about 1970, they'd actually built these cells. They were exactly the same as the police cells in Marston. And they'd put you in there, when you first went there, they'd put you in there to stop you absconding, I guess, because kids naturally want to run away from that place. So they put you in there, so you couldn't. These cells, same as police cells, there was nothing to do. They just locked you in there. It was a cold concrete box, and well, not cold sometimes, I suppose, like a big concrete room with nothing. Everything was concrete, except I think the sink. Exactly the same as a police cell.
And again, was there any contact between you and social workers or
no? They just put you in those cells and they just leave you there. Some of the kids used to go nutty in there, they'd be banging the doors and banging their heads on the walls and stuff like that, They couldn't really handle it,
We could just move perhaps to the bottom of page 9, Mr Taylor, where you've deposed to spending, you think, about 18 months in total in Apuni over the 3 times you were there?
It would have been about that, yes.
You talk in that paragraph about forming friendships and associations with the other boys at Apuni.
That's right. Well, when you're in a situation like that, I suppose it's a bit like the army, when you're under fire, you start bonding with the people around you, and that's what happens. And yeah, I formed associations with some of those kids, and we became quite close, some of us. We had to support each other, and that was our way to survive.
Did those associations continue into your adulthood?
They did, yeah. I'd come across many of the children from Ipuni and the prison wings around the country, in Borstal, and all over the place. And many of the prison wings I've been in, the majority of the prisoners in there are welfare kids, been through the system. Yeah, if you took them out of there, our prison wings would probably be shut down.
And just for those who don't know your story, Mr Taylor, I understand you're 63 years old? That's correct, yes. And how many of those years do you believe you've spent incarcerated?
Probably about 40. I'll just add another thing too. I noticed when I was in Borstal that a lot of the kids seemed to come from Pororu or Masterton, which probably might reflect how they were enforcing the legislation in those sort of towns, those 2 particular towns. It always struck out to me that most of the kids were from Pororu or Masterton. In those days, everybody south of Palmerston North went to Invercargill Borstal.
Right.
And everyone north of Palmerston North went to Waikeria. And it just stuck out,
I think we're perhaps going a little bit fast in terms of answers. Right. Sorry, so you were saying Invercargill for south of Palmerston North?
South of Palmerston North and south, Invercargill. Now these kids were, you imagine a kid from Marston, say, sent to the South Island, to Invercargill Borstal. They've got no family support, no visits, no nothing. And we know how vital it is to any sort of rehabilitation to retain family contact. It's absolutely vital. So what chance would have been? These were, like in those days, you could get sent to Borstal at the age of 15. Yeah, it's like a juvenile prison. And the other thing about Borstal is you didn't know how long you were going to do there. The sentence of the court was 0 to 2, which meant you could either be detained there 3 months or you might spend 2 years there. You just didn't know. And that's, as I say, Masterton and Pororu.
We've jumped ahead a little, so perhaps if we can go back and talk about how it is that you ended up in Porirua Hospital.
Oh, right. Yeah, well, one day I was undergoing this punishment that I've already told you about, of mowing this big rugby field, and a certain housemaster decided that he'd add to the punishment, and he had not only, after mowing that field, he wanted me to rake all the grass up as well, right, which is to a little child, and I guess I was then, it's a particularly onerous thing after you're pretty tired and stuffed from mowing that field, and it takes you away from the more, I used to like to get in and read books and things like, stuff like that when it's all finished. So I ended up throwing the rake at him, right, at this Mr. R, giving the name to the commission. And as a result, they took that as a sign of violence. So within 2 days, I was put in a car, taken out of the Puni Boys' home, and taken in front of a doctor, I think, and next to them in Porirua Hospital.
What input to that decision did your parents have? Do you know?
None whatsoever. In fact, by that stage, my parents had moved to Pororua, so they could visit me more often. And the first night I was there, they drugged me up to the eyeballs with all sorts of drugs. I couldn't even stand. My mum came up and she was appalled. She was in tears. She actually rang, I know from the records that I've read, she rang the boys home and abused the heck out of one of the housemasters she got hold of, you know, trying to understand what the hell am I doing in a psychiatric hospital, you know. And I was really drugged up to the eyeballs. Yeah.
In your statement, Mr Taylor, at paragraph 50, you describe being in that initial ward for about a week before being moved to a child and adolescent ward.
That's right. I think the name of the ward was Male 9, I think it was. Anyway, I was in there for about a week, and then I was moved to another ward. Now, in the one I was in to start with, there was adults in there. It wasn't just children. The one I was then moved to was all adolescents, you know, like younger children and adolescents. It was like a dormitory. There was probably about 25 kids in this dormitory, all housed together.
All boys?
All boys, yes.
And your memory in your statement was that you were there for about 3 or 4 months?
About that, yes. Yes.
And had no schooling during that period either? No
schooling whatsoever. I actually wanted to keep my learning up, so I used to go down to the library and study down there myself. Yeah. And I got in trouble for that because they used to say, well, you know, you've been away without permission and stuff like that, and threaten me with all sorts of punishments and take that as a sign of rebellion, you know, that I'm away from the ward without permission.
You said in your statement that one of those punishments was ECT?
That's right. Yeah, they used to threaten you with it. You know, I remember.
Did that happen to you?
No, I've never been given ECT. No, they used to threaten it though, and that was bad enough. You know, it wasn't used for medication or like treatment purposes. It was used as a punishment. And you just don't know what could happen to you. You see, they could fry your brain. You got little kids think that, you know, they think they're going to, you know, turn me into a zombie. And it's terrifying. It's really terrifying. You know.
In paragraph 51 of your statement, you talk about what you witnessed and experienced in that ward. Can you tell us about that?
These orderlies, they used to have orderlies. There used to be, I think it was about 2 on each shift. And I've seen them, you know, they weren't very, what we'd call child friendly. You know what children are like. Sometimes they just don't do what people want them to do. They'd slap them, they'd drag them around, they'd maltreat them. They'd throw them in seclusion rooms, solitary confinement, and it was again an atmosphere of fear that prevailed in that place. And
you talk in that same paragraph about witnessing sexual abuse while you were in that ward.
Yes, yeah, that's the first time I actually witnessed it. You know, saw it. You know,
by children on other children, is that correct?
Older children on younger children. Yeah, that's when I first saw it ever. Yeah. And I didn't even know what was going on, you know. I wasn't really wise in the ways of the world in that way myself in them days. I was still pretty young.
Are you able to say whether or not that type of behaviour was happening with knowledge of staff?
Well, they must have known what was happening because, you know, I mean, I'm sure some of the younger kids complained to them, you know, because I actually remember one instance where one of the young kids was beaten up by an older kid who had been, you know, he'd been sexually abusing him, and he said, "You've been telling the staff," you know, and he would beat them up for telling them. So I don't know how the heck he found out that, you know, there was nothing done about it anyway because nobody was moved or changed around or no punishments were imposed. Yeah.
Did you have any treatment while you were in this ward?
No, apart from being dosed up with drugs, you know, no. I had to learn in the end to safeguard myself. The other kids said to me, "Look, don't take those drugs, you know, just pretend to swallow them and hide them behind your tongue and spit them out later." That's the only way I sort of managed to keep on my feet, I guess.
No counsellor or social worker or anything at that point?
No, neither did any of the other children there.
Why were you released from the ward, do you know?
Eventually, I think the hospital authorities eventually told what we call them, the education department, the child welfare division, that I shouldn't be in that hospital, and they decided to release me back to my parents. And that's what happened. I went straight from the hospital back to my parents.
And I think, just so you know where we're at, that's paragraph 53 of your statement. And you were 15, you think, when you went back to your parents from the hospital?
It was about 19, yeah, about that, yeah.
And
it was about 1970, 71, so I would have been 14, 15.
And is that when you started working? You didn't go back to school?
That's right. I got a job at the Griffin's factory in Lower and started working there.
You've described it, paragraph 54, I think in Borstal. We don't necessarily need to go into the details of that today. Right. The commissioners have that in front of them.
Right.
But I think that ended, am I right, in your first sentence of imprisonment. Is that right?
No, I'd already got my first sentence of imprisonment for forgery.
For forgery, okay.
Yeah, and that's why I got sent to Invercargill Borstal.
Right.
Yeah, because the Borstals weren't like the child welfare institution. They were like prisons. They were part of the criminal justice system. Yeah, they went under the child welfare legislation.
Right.
You know, you got charged with crimes and got sentenced to that Borstal sentence from the age of 15 upwards.
Can we move now, Mr. Taylor, to talking about what you see as the impacts of the abuse in state care on you?
Well, I can say without a shred of doubt that if I hadn't ended up in that Ipuni boys' home, I would never have interacted with the criminal justice system. You know, I mean, up until I went to Ipuni boys' home, my only interaction with the police was there was a fight, and I used to have 2 paper routes. I used to do the Dominion Post, Dominion in them days in the morning. I used to do the Evening Post at night, right? So I used to do the early Dominion run, and I came across a police helmet one morning. I always remember this. There'd been a fight the night before, and one of the policemen had lost his helmet, so I dutifully took it up to the police station and handed it over and got thanked. That's my only interaction with the police up to that point. I didn't have any dealings with them whatsoever. And neither did any of my family either. That was it. That's what you did. And none of my family have had any dealings with the criminal justice system either, apart from me. And what's the difference between me and them? I went to Ipuni boys' home. And you heard Keith earlier talk about you know, most of the boys in Ipuni were from a lower socio-economic background. Well, I wasn't, because my parents were relatively well off. You know, they had money and a business.
What about effects on your health, your family, ability to have a family of your own?
Well, of course, obviously being imprisoned, you can't have a family of your own. So, you know, it stopped me from achieving things in life that I felt I could have achieved. And, well, basically, see, the point here also is that it's not only the effect on the child themselves, but their whole family. I mean, sisters come home to find their brothers missing. They don't know why or what's happened. It disrupts the whole family. It's not just in the, you know, and they just feel powerless. They don't know. It affects them too, you know.
And on your parents?
Well, my parents, well, as I say, my father got a bit more withdrawn and things, but my mum was really distraught about this, you know. She tried everything she could to try and get me out of that boys' home, to no avail. Like Keith, my best memories of that boys' home are leaving the place. That's my best memories of it. You know, just the relief at getting out of there. You know, it's like...
Why have you decided to participate in this inquiry's processes?
Well, a lot of the children that were in Ipuni with me, they're no longer with us. They're dead. And I think they need a voice to tell them, you know, what happened to them. So that they just weren't just a blip, you know, just gone, sunk without trace. And the other important thing is, hopefully, you know, I have a lot of faith in actually the fair-mindedness and reasonableness of the New Zealand public, which I have recently had experience of. I pressed the issue of prisoner voting. When I started campaigning relentlessly for the prisoner voting to be restored, we had 80 or 90% of the public against, right? The most recent Colmar Brunton, 53% of the public in favour of restoring prisoner voting. So I have great faith in the great New Zealand public's willingness to listen and be fair-minded, about issues. This has happened nowhere else in the Western world, prisoner voting. So I have great faith in them, and that's why this commission is doing a very important job, in my view, because people just don't believe it happened. It's like, how the hell could this go on in New Zealand? Country that respects the rule of law, got a great human rights record. How could it go on? So that's the important thing. We've got to, make the public aware, because this happened in their name. It was done on the state on behalf of the people of New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand. It wasn't some state official just suddenly decided to do this off their own bat through their own authority. So they need to know. And even if we only save one child from it, it's worthwhile. I often say to people when they say, well, you're up against an overwhelming hurdle, and some of the things you do, I say, hey, listen, one person that enters the criminal justice system, that can result in 50 victims. So that's what we're saving by just rehabilitating, and this is on the issue of prisoner rehabilitation rather than here.
Just a bit more slowly, sorry, Mr Taylor.
Yeah, why do you do it, One offender can result in 50, 60, 100 victims. They're all saved. So it's worth doing, even if we only save a few.
Can I ask you about redress?
Redress?
Because you've participated in process, I think, with both Ministry for Social Development and I think Ministry for Health, is that right?
That's right, yes I did.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, I engaged, when I got my records from the class, through the class process, I hadn't got a legal training by that stage. I basically approached MSD and laid it out for them. They did their inquiries, and I've got to say, they did a very good job. Within 6 months, they had admitted, they'd accepted what was done to me was wrong. And they offered an apology, and I'm not too happy about the terms of the apology because it was just a form written letter. I'm going to contrast that with the Ministry of Health in a minute, and pays us some compensation. But the main thing was having acknowledgement, because those involved in the criminal justice system know that the whole aim of it and what the people in prison are told is show remorse, accept, own your actions, but why isn't the state doing that here? That's what we can't understand. I mean, the state, as Keith sort of touched on, there's a general perception out there that it's doing everything it can. I'm not saying about the current Crown Council part of this, there may be a complete shift, is to use every delaying device it can to frustrate people, almost hoping they'll die off before it ever gets to court or something. That's the perception. It's very important that some sort of remorse and acceptance of responsibility is shown by the state. The state supposedly was, it's like they're our teachers in this sort of scenario. And if they're going to do that, then it's not a very good example. Well, you can't really close the book, So that went some way towards what the MSD did. But then I approached the health department, because the health department's assumed responsibility for what happened at PARAM Hospital. Complete change, right? They very quickly investigated and found what happened. And because I was representing myself, I dealt with the senior legal advisor for the Ministry of Health. I think it was Mr. Knipe, K-N-I-P-E. And the way he communicated with me, and the way he dealt with me, in the terms of his letter, that I felt was a genuine expression of remorse. He was genuinely remorseful for what had occurred. And that really closed the books on PARAM Hospital with me, but whereas it's not completely closed with Ipuni. Yeah. So, there's a difference. You can sort of pick up the tone and the vibe of these remorse letters. There's a hell of a difference between a form-written letter and a genuine apology. because that really is what nails it for me, you know, and I hope that something's been learnt from it. That's
Thank you. Can I ask you about the evidence you just mentioned, and also paragraph 73, we're on page 15, about a formal apology from the state. Talk to us about your feelings about that.
Well, the state, the head of state obviously is the Governor, you know, the Queen, as represented in this country by the Governor General. I feel that because this was, you know, the New Zealand government that basically did this, it should come from the head of state. You know, it had more weight and impact. I mean, in some of the treaty settlements we've got, you know, in the Treaty of Waitangi process, the apology comes from the head of state, you know, on behalf of the head of state, and it has more impact. It has, you know, the whole community's not the whole community, but the government has accepted responsibility. That something went wrong, and they want to do what they can to make it right.
Is there anything else that you think the state can do to make it right?
Well, there's a heck of a lot of people still in prison as a result of having gone through this process that I don't think would be there if they hadn't. Obviously, I'm not there anymore, but there's still a lot of people in prison as a result of you know, this intervention on their lives by the state. I think some sort of special sort of procedural process should be set up in relation to prisoners who went through this process, and it can be reasonably established. Probably wouldn't have been in there if they hadn't gone through the state care system. In other words, their lives would have been completely different, and, you know, perhaps in relation to helping them with extra, you know, because there's extra over and above rehabilitation and perhaps resettlement when they get out of prison, to sort of put them in a position where they might have been if the state hadn't intervened in their lives in this fashion. Whereas now they're sort of just dealt with the same as anyone else, when they've got special sort of rights. I feel they've got an extra claim on the state over and above what anyone else has.
And at paragraph 71 of your statement, I think you talk about that, and you say in the last line there that there needs to be better support on the outside for people released. What do you suggest? Well,
as a result of, you know, becoming involved with the state, a lot of them have got quite serious drug and alcohol problems, and once they get that shackle around their neck, that's it. Until they remove it, that's it. Their lives are doomed. You know, well, not to normality anyway. They're not going to lead a normal life, right? So I think you know, some special effort, some funding, something has got to be put into particularly helping them in relation to drug and alcohol problems.
You mentioned before about your hopes that what New Zealand as a society will do, will respond, perhaps. Yes.
There needs to be a general recognition that the family, as in a lot of international instruments we've signed up to, the ICCPR, you know, the UNCROC, United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child, that the family is the basic unit of society, that's where, you know, everyone gets their nurturing and their protection and they venture out to explore the world, I suppose, from. It needs to receive proper recognition that you do not remove a child from their family, whānau, unless, you know, it's probably to save them, you know, from serious abuse or physical danger or something. Now there's too much, it seems to me, there's lip service given. And we're probably all familiar with there's been a recent upsurge in children being uplifted by OT from, you know, from hospital and things like that. That's solely down, I believe, they put a couple of sections, I think it was 17B and 17A into the former SIF Act, before the OT Act, and it basically said that if a mother's had a child uplifted previously, then you go and then uplift that next child. Now, their situation could be completely different, you know. They might be completely different to what they were 5 years ago, for instance, you see. And there's a heck of a lot of distress and anger and all sorts of things being caused in our communities because, again, going back to how the law is actually administered, some districts seem to be, you know, there's a bit of discretion built into the Act, but there's some social workers that are just going there and that's their first course, you know, take that child. And it interferes with the fundamental bonding between parents and a child. And they might say, oh yeah, well there'll be a court hearing a bit later down the track and we'll fix all this up. But hey, if a child's had their bonding interrupted and disturbed, it's not going to be fixed up, especially in that first 48 hours. So there needs to be some very, very strict guidelines and policies, perhaps brought out by OT, to govern how those sections in that Act are being used. And we've seen, look at some of the recent media publicity where it's painting OT in a very bad light, when basically they're just trying to do their job properly. But, some of the officers believe that they have to go and do that without, invoking some subjective judgment. And it's as bad as it was back in when they were taking children like me and throwing me in Ipuni. It's having ongoing effects on these children, I believe. So there needs to be a revisiting of that, and quite urgently too.
Mr Taylor, we've gone through what was a comprehensive statement that you provided to us. Thank you. Is there anything else, perhaps in a forward-looking from now, that you'd like to comment on?
No, I think I pretty much covered it. It's just great to see that we're finally airing these issues, because until you realise you've got a problem, you can't do anything about it. It's never going to be fixed. And it's a great thing, and I hope the people of New Zealand understand that this Royal Commission is doing a very important job. I also hope, as I think Keith may have commented earlier, that whatever the eventual report that comes out of the Royal Commission is not just pigeonholed or put away somewhere, but that it's been the result of massive consideration of evidence. It's been the result of a lot of thinking and a lot of public money, and that it isn't just done for nothing. It's it should be acted upon. Obviously the commissioners, they're not going to be making recommendations that they don't feel are very soundly based. And why should they be pigeonholed and not acted upon? As I say, it's to save the people of New Zealand a hell of a lot of expenditure of public funds, a lot of heartbreak and distress that's unnecessary. It's unnecessary. That's the whole point of it. I feel it's totally unnecessary. What happened to me was totally unnecessary. But I have a bit of perspective. I don't hate anyone aboard. Because, when I think about it, sometimes I just think, hey, this little kid's up in Starship Hospital, 3 years old, they're not going to have a life, and you sort of look at it that way. And that sort of helps to balance it a bit. Yeah.
Thank you.
But you still worship them out.
I wonder, Mr Chair, whether that's a time to inquire.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms Beaton. Can I ask if any council has any wish to ask Mr Taylor any questions? Ms Sykes.
Kei te mihi atu au ki a koe, e te rangatira. Ka huri atu au ki tērā o ngā reo, engari kei te mihi I te āhuatanga o tō whakatau I te rānei. In the commencement of your brief, you describe this process as one of a stolen generation.
Yes.
And it's a context I'm very familiar of in terms of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. You seem to use it in a broader way. Could you please amplify that?
The context originally, of course, is the removal of children from, half-caste children from their Aboriginal mothers, stolen from their, but for no particular reason other than that the state felt that they'd get a better life and education, much as happened here, I guess, in some instances. It is in a wider sense because this was our stolen generation. There were 100,000 plus kids went through the system. 100,000. Our population at the time was 3.5 million, I think. That's a big proportion. The whole generation.
And so the generation we're talking of is that which you were directly a part of. So those children impacted upon by state policy in the 1960s and the 1970s.
That's right. Yes.
There's also a generation that's followed that's been impacted on it, isn't it?
That's right. Of course, as I earlier touched on, it just doesn't affect these 100,000. There's their whānau, their family, their sisters, their parents, everybody. There's a whole. We're talking about a direct impact on hundreds of thousands, probably, of people, that have been hurt by this. So that's why I call it a generation.
So if we're moving forward, my last question, how do we deal with the systemic impact of dislocation of children like yourself, interstate care,
Well,
having regard to your family's loss as well, your whānau loss as well?
Well, obviously one of the things that I think it's done through the FGC process is we make sure whānau family are widely consulted. They know what's best for their whakapuna, their children. They know what's best, you know. Okay, there's bad whānau, there's bad everybody, right? But they need to be consulted and listened to. That's what I often say. These people that are making decisions, they seem to impose what they want. I'll liken it to this. Let's say the warehouse, right? We'll liken it in a commercial sense, right? They tell their customers, you're going to buy this, you're going to do this price, that it wouldn't be tolerated. But this is what happens with the state. They don't consult those that are most directly affected by their decisions. They just seem to decide what's best and impose it over and above the wishes of whānau, everybody.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
That's right.
Thank you, Ms Sykes. No other counsel? Colleagues? Dr Eruiti.
Mr Taylor, I've just got a few quick questions. Thank you. And thank you for your testimony. Kia koe. First of all, you talk about in the context of redress about the idea of trying to restore the survivor to the position they would have been in had they not been taken into care. And that seems to indicate that forms of redress should be more than only monetary compensation.
Right. Well, obviously we can never restore them to the situation they might have otherwise been in, but we can perhaps make, special allowances for them when it comes to housing, perhaps state social housing, and recognition that the state owes these people a particular, perhaps because it let them down with its duty of care in earlier days, and now it's going to make up for it and make them feel a heck of a lot better. And that's what it's all about. The thing they've been listened to, and that some effective steps have been taken, rather than just, a lot of people, they just look on it as empty words, some concrete stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and you also spoke about the mixing of children from a care and protection background and those with a justice background, and that's emphasised quite a lot in your proof of evidence.
That's fundamental. I don't know, why would you mix kids that are in there for issues and nothing to do with committing a criminal offence? Why would you possibly mix them 24/7 with kids that are in for serious criminal offences, and expect that nothing's going to, that's not going to wash off on them, that they're not going to be affected by it or taken on, we don't accept in any other area of life where you mix people that they're not going to take on some of the mores of the people they're going to mix with, so why would you in that context? And I understand, give OT its dues, that they're very awake to this sort of thing now. And they'd make every effort not to mix children and youth justice and care and protections. Thank you.
And my last question is about your time in Porirua Hospital. And it seemed that was, the suggestion was that was directly linked to your throwing the rake at the supervisor. So you're being punished by being taken to a psychiatric hospital.
Well, my understanding, obviously not then, because I had no understanding of it. I just knew I ended up in a psychiatric hospital. You're in a psychiatric hospital for treatment, aren't you? So why are you there for throwing a rake at, and this is all documented in the records I got through class. That's why I was there. But we had the Ombudsman investigated this some time back about when all this was happening. What was happening is that the Child Welfare Authorities thought that because they had a state ward order, that entitled them to have you committed to a psychiatric hospital. Now, of course, that's not the case, and the Ombudsman found that, and it stopped. But when I was going through it, they still believed they could. That's why you had a lot of children ending up in like Lake Alice and things, but they'd never been properly medically assessed as to whether they warranted psychiatric care. The state was using its guardianship authority to put them where the hell it felt like, including a psychiatric hospital, where they could get, subjected to all the things that people do in those places, electric shock treatment, and that sort of thing. I mean, it's just amazing to me why there was no legal input into this. No legal consideration as to what their powers and, authority, what they were authorised to do in law. We're meant to be a society run on the rule of law. At the moment we lose sight of that, and public officials start acting as they feel fit, or as they think this thing should be as they want them to be. We're going down the road to the law of the jungle, and nobody wants that, do we?
Kia ora. Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you. Ms. Alofivae.
Mr. Taylor, thank you very much for the generosity and the openness in which you gave your evidence. It was greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
My question really arises out of your comments, which were really welcomed around the subsequent children's legislation and the impact that that had intergenerationally in the context that you described of the people that you then met later on in jail that had already been epuni with you. Going right back to 1968 when they did the psychological report on you, which was actually very helpful, but which wasn't used, and the impact that obviously they do psychological reports today. But I think the point, and I just want to clarify that you're trying to make, is the lack of investment actually in the backstory of the prisoners that and the road that they've travelled.
Exactly.
Is that correct?
That's right. Well, I mean, the criminal justice system set up to punish offenders, right? But let's look at this. They're not these ones that have been through this system. They haven't got the same level of culpability, I guess we'd call it in law, for their offending. Perhaps that can be addressed by the Section 27 report process. But there needs to be some recognition that they're not just someone that woke up one morning and decided, I'm going out and going to be breaking the law. They were sort of put in that position by the state. And okay, there's people going to say, well, not all of them went on to offend. Well, hey, the overwhelming majority of them did. And I'll say to those people too, what if this happened to you? What would your chances of leading a crime-free life be? Yeah. We all know criminals aren't born; they're made. Despite the likes of people like certain talkback radio hosts like to sort of lead the public to believe. Yeah, and they were made by the state.
So the Section 27 cult reports that you're referring to, there's a lever there, but it's not used well enough.
It's not. I was at a recent legal conference in Northland where Judge Davis, Matarangi Courts, he emphasised to a lot of the legal counsel there that they need to start using the Section 27 process. So the court's fully aware of the offender's cultural background and what motivated him or her to offending, and that the courts will give substantial discounts in appropriate cases. So, the legal profession needs to take its share of this on board and start utilising that process which was built into our Sentencing Act and going down that road.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. No
That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, sir.
That brings the proceedings for today to an end, and I would ask you, Madam Registrar, to close the Royal Commission proceedings for today with a view to resuming at 10 a.m. tomorrow.
If we could all remain seated, we opened this morning with the karakia and a waiata, and we'll close the day with the karakia and a waiata.
Kia kunui kia pulahi, ura mene mene mai nei, nā te miti whakaora kotai, anei nā te whātua e mihi atu nei, kia koutou katoa, I tēnei ahi, te tai mai e mātou, I rau I te korowai o te manaakitanga, ki ngā tāngata ko pānia, I nei hara, I nei mamaitanga, ke konei mātou ki te tuku, e ngāka aroha, e mihi aroha, e mihi manaakitanga, kia koutou. Ko tai mai mātou ki te tuku etahi whakamoemiti, etahi tarakia, te hiki nā te taumahatanga, I te tauritanga I rungi nā puko iwi o te hunga ko tai mai I tēnei. I tēnei, ai. Nō reira, ladies and gentlemen, we are Ngāti Whātua Rake, It's our privilege to come here with a warm heart, with love, whānau, and compassion for all of the people that have shared their tragic stories and experiences. We're here to close with the karakia, and we'll be coming in every morning and every afternoon to open and close these formalities today. So I thank you for that opportunity. Tātua, as Kaimanaki, as mana whenua, to come along, show our aloha in support to this occasion. I'm going to go to Whai Rangi, who will close with a whakamainati or a prayer. Could I just ask that you all please be standing?
Kua heke tēnei nohoanga, tēnā koa e tū. The sitting is adjourned, all stand.